Coming up on Getting Divorced Without Losing Your Mind is the tools you'll need to approach your divorce more strategically and less reactively.
Hello and welcome. I'm glad you're here. This is Getting Divorced Without Losing Your Mind, the podcast inspired by my book of the same title to help you become more creative and less reactive in your divorce. I am your host, Corey Shapiro. Last time we finished a series on divorce attorney tactics. We talked about the swarmer. We talked about the brawler, the boxer, the top dog. And if you haven't consumed that content yet, no worries. It's on the archive. Check it out if you want to learn a little bit about all these tactics and to see what the opposing spouse is doing, or maybe if you're interviewing your own attorney, to figure out what style works best for you. This episode, we're starting a new series. And it's an important series because if the first part of what we've been talking about was foundational, working on ourselves, and then we got a little bit into the budget, then we got a little bit into divorce attorney tactics. Now we're going to get into the court system. Ooh, the court system. It's all scary, the court system. And it really is scary the first time. There's an adrenaline rush. It's like getting on stage. Even if you're an actor, I think on Broadway, I've done it many times. I am sure there's an adrenaline rush when you get on stage. And that's what going court is for. And a lot of attorneys are probably frustrated actors, or comedians. So they really enjoy court. But for the civilians, for the clients, not the same way. Could be overwhelming. So this episode is all about the court conference. The court conference and what are some things you need to know and what is really going on and what do you have to do. So we're starting this series on the court system with the court conference. We're going to move on to talking about next time when court conferences don't work, but you don't want a trial. You're sort of in the middle. You need maybe some informal recommendation by the judge. We're going to talk about that next episode. Then we're going to finish it off with do-overs when the court makes a mistake. That will be after trial or after a decision is made, and we have some do-overs. But let's get back to the court conference, and that's what we're discussing today. Whew. All right. But before we do that, why don't we talk about a great quote I found from Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman Supreme Court Justice, who unfortunately is no longer with us, but served for so long. And her quote is protection for me because we are giving feedback to judges in this section, right? So here's the quote. The freedom to criticize judges and other public officials is necessary to a vibrant democracy. So if any judge I appear before gets wind of this podcast somehow, we're going to be very safe and very polite and very respectful, and we're going to cite Justice O'Connor for the proposition that we are allowed to give feedback to judges. All right. So with that said, with being the most respectful we can be to the court system, let's first understand the overriding principle, the public policy of what all this is based on. Now, the court system reminds me a lot like police officers. How am I making that in comparison? Well, let me tell you. In New York City, there's probably about 8 million people, right? But there's only 40,000 police officers. So what does that assume? Most of us are doing the right thing, and when we encounter a police officer, we do what they say. We are not oppositional. We don't fight them. If everyone was fighting police officers, then we probably would need a lot more than 40,000 officers to deal with 8 million people. And the same thing with court. The court has authority. The court has respect. And if everyone wanted a 2-month trial to talk about everything they could possibly talk about to the judge, no one would get divorced in some of these bigger cities. So the system is really set up for settlement for the most part. All right. So now that you understand the public policy, Why would I need a court conference? I mean, I'm just getting divorced. Do I have to bring in the state? This is ridiculous. Isn't this just for lawyers to make so much money? And those are some good thinking there. And probably that is true in part. But there are times when you would need the court system. Okay. And that's when you need some help. Yes, you're going to need some help. And what am I talking about? Let's say you're not getting information you need. You could be in a mediation and you could be discussing numbers, but the other side's not giving you financial information you need. In the mediation, can you subpoena information? No, you can't. You can only do that if you're in a litigation, right? So sometimes you do need the court system. You do need the legal system if people are going to act out, just like sometimes we do need police officers to help us. Okay, so that's why we need court. Now, let's talk about the basics. Another basic idea. What is a court conference? What happens? Well, the first court conference here in New York is called a preliminary conference, but it could be initial court conference. I think a couple of things are going on. First, it's making sure there's financial disclosure. Here in New York, you have what's called a statement of net worth or a financial affidavit, financial disclosure affidavit, where you got to list your expenses. You got to list your income. You got to list your assets and your debts if you have any. You got to even list, in some jurisdictions, if you transferred any assets in the last 3 years. You got to attach your income tax return from last year, your W-2, maybe your 1099 or K-1 if you have that. Partnership or other type of income. And you really got to go in there with your, cards on display. We're not keeping our cards close on our financial. That's not how the matrimonial works. We're being almost like an open card game. I actually play cards, with my wife often, and she's always looking at my cards in some games, especially playing, Uno. And she's really good at remembering what I'm having. So, we're being open-minded about our cards here. We're just being here's our cards. Let me see your cards. And we're trying to be very forthright in what we have. That's the big thing a court does. Another thing it does is there's automatic disclosure with documents. So you got to turn over maybe 3 years of your bank statements, your credit card statements, your investments, your retirements. This is just there's clarity. There's transparency. That's what's happening in the court system. It's just okay, you really want to come to court? You got to give me all your finances. You got to be transparent with all the documents to prove what you're saying in your financial, disclosure affidavit. If you're saying, hey, why would I need all these documents? I'm putting it all in my financial disclosure affidavit. Lawyers and judges like to verify. We verify. We don't just take your word for things. So we need to verify that. So that's what's happening. And that's what a court conference is. Also, another thing is they do scheduling for the whole case. On that first time, they'll schedule out when you have to, exchange certain type of discovery information. That's just what type of information you need. If you have to do a deposition, that's basically the ability to ask questions about your spouse under oath outside of court, before a stenographer or court reporter. It's outside of court, but I just call them a court reporter. Don't mean to confuse anyone. Just a reporter. And you can also discuss any type of temporary issues that need to be, addressed. If, for example, you are the non-moneyed spouse and the other side turned off your credit cards, hasn't given you any money to support yourself or the children, that's what the court deals with at that initial court conference. Okay. Also, you're going to meet, let's just call the judge an 800-pound gorilla. I mean, a lot of spouses come to me and they're they don't use this word, but this is what I think. My spouse is a wild dog. I'm carrying on that, that theme of dogs. Wild dog. Crazy, like a pit bull. And I'm the judge is 800-pound gorilla. I don't think the judge cares. And what I mean by that, the judge does what the judge wants to do. You don't get in the way of an 800-pound gorilla. And if the judge is on you, watch out. And you don't want the judges to be on you, so you have to give this information. And especially that first couple of conferences, don't get on the judge's bad side. Even you. who thinks you can, don't. All right. So let's talk about these roadblocks. We talked a lot about the first one. It takes so much time to give that financial disclosure. The second big roadblock is you have to come up with a narrative, a frame. So what that means is you got to tell your attorney all of the information, even that sensitive information that you don't really want to tell them. And if you have a good attorney, they mix all that up like a good chef, mixing it all up into this souffle, which works. It's like, oh my God, how did you make this amazing souffle with only 2 ingredients? That's what your attorney is good at. So they're creating a narrative. They're taking all that information and packaging it in a way that's going to resonate with the court. And that's what you're working on. Now, it's not so important in that first conference, and you could probably not do this, but the best of the best are doing it early. So every time you go to court, you are on, even though there's only a 3% or 4% chance you actually have to go to trial, you actually have to use this narrative. We prepare for the worst. That's the best attorneys, and that's going to help you hopefully get better settlements. So you're preparing early. We also talked about, that disclosure you have to give. Now, all this narrative, it just costs a lot. It's a lot of time, a lot of energy. It costs money. Lawyers are billing by the hours. So this is all of these roadblocks that the court is doing to make sure you're being serious. And if you come to court, you have real issues. Okay, so let's make sure you understand this. I'm going to do a little exercise, not such a hard question today, but it's so important to start a divorce off in the right footing that we're going to review it. So question is, would you need to go to court under these facts, knowing nothing more than what I'm going to tell you? You commence a divorce action, you serve your spouse, you then have your attorney reach out when your spouse, files a note of appearance. That's what they would do, file a notice of appearance to say, I'm in this litigation. And then your attorney reaches out to them, and says, let's exchange financial disclosure. Let's exchange this statement of net worth or financial disclosure affidavit or whatever you call it in your jurisdiction. And let's do it in 2 weeks. And they don't respond. So maybe you respond again, you follow up, maybe even you call, and they're just silent treatment. They're like ghosting you. So is that a situation where you need a court to help you? Bing, 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 bing. If you said yes, that's the case that you need court help. Now, let's just twist the facts a little bit. Let's say your spouse, after being served, says, I really want to work things out in private. I don't really want to go to court. You don't really know all of the situation, but I want to be totally transparent with you. Is that when you would need court? No, I don't know. On the one hand, there are different avenues to take, like mediation or collaborative divorce. The difference is in collaborative divorce, you would have an attorney representing you, and advocating for you. In mediation, a little bit more neutral, but you still have a third-party professional, not your attorney, but a third-party professional helping you, facilitating a settlement. But in that situation, maybe you do want to keep things private. Maybe that you didn't file tax returns in the last 5 years. Maybe your books and records are shady. Maybe something's going on that you really don't want the court to know about. Because remember, the court has to report a lot of, if there's, tax issues, they can report this stuff. So if you have, you're not filing tax returns, or you have a business, but you're using a lot of it for, personal expenses, like really egregious, like paying for your kids, bat mitzvah, egregious. That stuff is not going to fly with the court. So maybe you do want to try to work on a private settlement earlier, not even in the court system. And you see a lot of cases do settle before going to court, but at least you're starting that process. So there you go. There's some things to think about if you are starting a divorce and you need to go to court. I hope understanding a little bit more about the court system is helping you, that they're for settlement, that it's intensive to do this financial disclosure, that you gotta come up with a narrative early on, even if you're not going to use this, to be persuasive. And sometimes maybe you really don't want to go to court because you have a very sensitive and private matter. All right, next episode, we're going to move on to what happens when you maybe have had a court conference or two and you settled maybe 80, even 90% of the issues, but you just need some help on a couple more issues. What can you do if you're in the court system? And we're going to talk about getting the court to give what's called, an advisory opinion or an informal recommendation or suggestion to help you, save you so much time, energy, and money so you don't need a trial. And we're going to talk about that next episode. So I thank you. I thank you for really tuning in, for taking time out of your schedule, which I know is busy. I know it's hard right now. I know you've got a lot of competing interests. It's difficult. And I really appreciate you taking the time to work on your divorce, not just in it. Your divorce attorney can't do it alone the way you want if you can't direct them. I always tell people, think of your attorney as an advisor. So for example, I'm an advisor. I'm like the general, but you're the president. You make the decisions and you want to make the best decisions you can. And you can only do that if you're balanced and if you have a little bit of information you need. And I hope this podcast, my book, gives you that so you can make these better decisions. So I am your host, Corey Shapiro. Join me next time on Getting Divorced Without Losing Your Mind.
Thank you for tuning in to the Getting Divorced Without Losing Your Mind podcast. We would love to hear your feedback. Send Corey an email to feedback@gettingdivorced.org. And if you've read his book, please consider leaving an Amazon review. This podcast offers general information only. It cannot replace legal advice. If you need tailored advice, contact an attorney licensed to practice in your area.